Hello, hello. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll get started in a few seconds. Um, I just wanted to start with a little housekeeping before we start the actual webinar. As always, I am joined by Bianca, and we will be here monitoring the chat. Should you have any sort of technical issues, you can always use the chat or the Q&A if you have questions or if you wanted to respond to something in the webinar. But if you have any technical issues with Zoom, the sound, the audio, Bianca and myself will be here to monitor that and help with that. And then if you are just joining us for the first time, this is a part two in a four-part webinar series. So the first part is on our website, and you can go back and watch that if you want before this. This one is also going to be recorded and put on our website as well, so you can watch this at a later time if you need to. And then every month, so what month is this? April. And then May we'll have part three, and June we will have part four. But let me talk to you a little bit about Ember. Ember is our host for today. Ember Maselli is a social worker, researcher, and trainer with over a decade of experience working at the intersections of domestic violence, mental health, and substance use. Ember has conducted and supported mixed methods research, evaluation, and training initiatives to inform healthcare, social services, education, and public policy. Ember has an MSW, and Ember leads with survivor-centered, peer-led approaches with a focus on equity and accessibility. They have a special interest in disability justice, traumatic brain injury, and people with lived experience working in the DV movement. Ember holds an MSW, as I said, from Florida State University and lives in Chicago with her daughter and two dogs. Ember's website is on the link that you got for today's webinar, but we will also put that in the chat, and Ember put an email address if you have any questions that you would like to ask privately. And again, thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ember. Ember, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Erin and Bianca. It's so nice to be here again. I'm looking forward as to how we progress as we move forward through this four-part series. Like Erin said, last month we started talking about domestic violence and people with disabilities and kind of laying the foundation of that. I'll do a little bit of review just in case you were not able to attend that. But today we're going to talk a lot about dynamics and systemic barriers and what it looks like for survivors. So I'm very excited to move forward. And as Erin said, if you have any questions as we're moving through, please feel free to ask in the chat. I'll pop it up and try to answer as we move along. I'll also have some spots where I'll pause for us to just take a breath and you can ask questions there. And again, you can also email me if you have any questions afterwards. Sometimes folks would just prefer to take time to write it down, or you're kind of sitting and thinking later and you come up with a question. I'm more than happy to answer those. I'm always available, even if it's like months from now and you're like, hey, I have that person's email from this webinar. Please email me. I'm more than happy to help, or direct you to somebody who might be able to help and provide some support. Um, so as Erin said, I'm a social worker. My background is primarily in domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I'm also somebody who is disabled. I have mental health conditions. I also have medical conditions. So I kind of lead from that perspective as I'm doing my work. And I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. So it's a big part of what I do is listening to people who have had these experiences and incorporating them in the work that I do, and not just coming from books and professors and studies, which is also a really important part of the work I do, but it's only one real part. Everything else kind of comes from that lived experience. And again, I live in Chicago. I love it here. I have two dogs and my daughter, which you can see here. Odie is the old man in the corner, and he recently survived for 3 days in the wilderness when he got loose. And by wilderness, I mean Chicago. But he's doing very well. And this is my little dog Punk, who's a little smiley one, and my daughter Ara. And we're here in Chicago. but I have worked nationally and internationally in the space, and I've been really excited to work with New Jersey ARC to provide this. So, what we're going to talk about today is reviewing the definition and nature of domestic violence and what that looks like. We're going to talk about ableism and intersectionality because those definitions are going to kind of set the stage for how we talk about domestic violence and people with disabilities moving forward. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of abuse against people with disabilities and then the systemic barriers. So, things that our systems do to make it harder for people to get support and services and safety. And these systems include things like schools, doctors' offices, therapists, domestic violence shelters, law enforcement, the courts, child protective services, like all of these different systems that we interact with that are both formal and informal. It could be things like, a mom group at school or any other systems that you're interacting with. But today we're really going to talk about these big ones that are kind of following policy at a governmental level. And all of this is going to help us kind of understand the ways that disability and stigma can be leveraged against survivors of domestic violence. Um, Today is a little bit of kind of the bummer day. When we did our presentation in March, we kind of talked a lot about prevalence and types of abuse. Today, we're really going to be talking about what that looks like for survivors with disabilities. But then in May, we're going to be talking a lot more about what we can do. So this is kind of laying the groundwork of understanding the foundations of domestic violence, what that can look like, how folks with disabilities are navigating that. And then we're going to continue to build on that with what we can do, how we're building connections over the next 2 months. So I don't want this to feel like, oh no, everything is terrible and I don't know what to do, because sometimes that's how these things can end up feeling. And if you're feeling that, that's fine. And know that I have more that's going to help us build on this and help us feel like we have power in this situation where things can kind of sometimes feel a little bleak. So if you want to add these to your calendar, that'd be great. And I'm sorry, the date is wrong. It says obviously today is not the 7th. So I apologize about that. I had to kick this up a week. But yeah. And just some quick notes as we're getting started. First, about the language that I use. I primarily use the term survivor to talk about someone who's experienced domestic violence, and the term abuser or abusive partner for someone who has committed violence or controlling behavior within a relationship. There's lots of different terms that people use. Some people like to be called a survivor. Some people like to use the term victim. It's really kind of up to the individual what they want to call themselves. But as we move through, I'll primarily be saying survivor and abuser. And I will also talk about people with disabilities using both person first and identity first language at some point, I'm sure, because that's what I use. And so sometimes I slip into that. But I use both and respect both. So they'll both be there. Talking about gender, all genders can be survivors or abusers. All genders experience disability. But we will be talking about gender in some ways to talk about power imbalances. So a lot of times I will use maybe female pronouns, talk about survivors as women and abusive partners as men. Sometimes that's what comes out. That's what the majority of the literature focuses on, the majority of where we get our research from. But domestic violence can occur in any kind of relationship, regardless of gender. So I just want to lay that out here. And another thing is the data and prevalence and studies that I use to support my work. Domestic violence is very underreported, and that goes doubly for violence against people with disabilities. And a lot of the data is aggregated. So we're only seeing it as it exists, kind of summarized all together. What can we say about this that everybody has in common? And so a lot of times we're not getting kind of the nitty gritty little details, especially from folks who are experiencing more marginalization or feeling more pushed outside because they have a disability or because of other aspects of their identity that are traditionally marginalized in our society. Another thing is that a lot of the data that I have is dated. It's older data. A lot of it uses federal reports, which are flawed in the best of times. And right now, the reports that are being used for this are not being published in a lot of instances. So that's also just another aspect of this to consider as we move forward. And my last note, kind of before we really jump in, is to take care of yourself. As I said, this is a bit of a heavier topic. This is something that can be challenging to talk about. It may be something that you've never talked about with people in your life. It may be something that's a huge part of your life. And it also may be something that feels very comfortable to talk about, or something that maybe makes you feel feelings that you don't want to feel, or feeling fear or discomfort or anything like that. So I encourage you to just take care of yourself both during this time and afterwards. If you're noticing that you're having a reaction or something like that, I have some resources at the end for organizations you can reach out to for support. And you're also more than welcome to email me about that. Even if you just are like, I just want to say this and get it out, I'm happy to respond to that. So take care of yourselves during this time. Take a little shake out, stand up and stretch, do what you need to do. Um, that would be great. Yes, and as Erin said, this is being recorded. So if you run into something and you're like, "Whoa, this is a bit much for right now," there will be a recording available. So you will have all of that. And I will also be sharing my slides with Erin and Bianca. So they'll be able to share that with you as well. So, and you can also enjoy this photo I took a couple of weeks ago of the Chicago skyline at the beach. So I incorporate photos that I take, so I don't have to pay for stock photos. So hopefully you enjoy them. All right. So I'm going to review this a little quicker than I did last time. But I just want to make sure that we are reminded of and have the foundation of what domestic violence is. So, domestic violence, sometimes also called intimate partner violence, is a pattern of intentional behaviors intended to assert power and control over a partner or a former partner. The things that I really want to emphasize as we're going through is that abuse is a pattern of intentional behavior. There can be abusive behaviors that occur in a relationship. There can be harmful behaviors that occur in a relationship. But when we're talking about domestic violence, we're really talking about a pattern of repeated intentional behaviors that are geared at asserting power and control over a partner or a former partner. And something I think I didn't talk about as much last time as I wanted to, because again, I feel like every slide I could turn into an hour-long talk, if not more, is that abuse doesn't end when the relationship ends. Specifically, women are at the highest risk of being murdered by their former partner in the 2 years after they leave. Leaving is kind of one of the big predictors of severe harm or even death for a survivor, because that's when the power and control that that abusive partner has been looking for is getting ripped away in a really dramatic way, in a really impactful way. So I just want to say that we are talking about partners, but we're also talking about former partners. There are lots of folks who are co-parenting with an abusive partner, or even are working with an abusive partner, or just enmeshed with an abusive partner that they're no longer dating, but maybe they're still legally married, or they have so much family together that it makes it difficult for that relationship to just straight up end. Um, and this is also especially a factor for folks with disabilities who may um, have support needs in their community and within their family that necessitate them being around an abusive partner or former partner more than they would like to be. So we talked about abuse tactics last month, but I just want to quickly refresh them and just have this in the slides so you can come back and look at it if you need to. But abuse can range pretty broadly. Mostly what we are thinking of when we think about domestic violence is the physical abuse. There's also sexual abuse, emotional and psychological abuse, financial abuse, isolation. So keeping that person from friends, family, work, any way that they could kind of have a line to the outside. We also talked to a lot of survivors who've experienced spiritual abuse, stalking, cyber abuse, and restricting access to care, restricting access to healthcare, mental health care, substance use care, things like that. So this is kind of, I hate to say like basic domestic violence, but this is kind of the foundation of what domestic violence can look like. And we're going to start talking about how disability adds to the experience of being a survivor and what that looks like, and how abusive partners and systems respond when the person who's a victim of domestic violence also has a disability or has multiple disabilities. Um, So I want to think about domestic violence and these abusive tactics, the physical violence, the sexual violence, the isolation, the coercion, things we're going to talk about against folks with disabilities. I want us to think about these as locks on a door. So the person who's in that relationship, that survivor, is trying to get out of this door of abuse. And all of these tactics are kind of locks on the door. It's an additional barrier. This metaphor kind of falls apart if you think about being on the inside of the door, but let's pretend that we have to open these ourselves and we're looking for the key. We're kind of more locked in. That person is more locked into this relationship. So I want us to just have this image in our heads. It helps me kind of frame it. And it also will help us talk about these tactics as things that are keeping that person trapped in that relationship more and more. And when we look at the power and control wheel, these things are keeping that person trapped in the relationship more and more. The physical violence, the sexual violence, economic abuse, using children, denying that the abuse happened, using intimidation tactics, that's all keeping someone within that relationship. They're all locks on the door. So I want to talk about people with disabilities and abuse. These are things that we talked about last month, but I want to review them again, which is that people with disabilities are twice as likely to be abused by a partner than those without a disability. And people with disabilities report more severe physical abuse than those without a disability. About 80% of disabled women have been sexually assaulted, and the majority of those were by an intimate partner. So we know that disability is something that is associated with a higher risk of domestic violence. So this happens for a couple of reasons. One is that abusive partners are often looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. They're looking for ways that they can overpower somebody. And somebody who has a disability is facing a lot, could be facing a lot of challenges with moving through their daily life. And so an abusive partner has more ways that they can lock the door, more things that they can do to keep this person in that relationship or within their control. And a big way that this happens for survivors with disabilities through ableism. So ableism is a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities. And often it's on the fact that people think that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or another, or that there's something wrong with, there's nothing morally or inherently wrong with somebody being disabled. It just is. Disability is. Some disabilities can be cured, some disabilities do disappear. But we know that for the vast majority of people with disabilities, they are lifelong. So I just want to talk about that in this frame of ableism, these set of beliefs that devalue and discriminate against people. It's also important to remember that a lot of times this happens for good reasons. There can be medical professionals or advocates or providers who, because they have these false beliefs that people with disabilities need to be fixed, that they are not as valuable, that they are not as capable, can make people feel like maybe they have to infantilize, they have to step in and take a caregiving role when that's not appropriate. It doesn't matter that they're doing it to be nice, because it's still having the harmful effect. And I want to make sure we talk about both ableism that is intentional and cruel, and ableism that occurs because folks are not thinking about the needs of people with disabilities, which is harmful, which is causing active harm and barriers to survivors with disabilities. And these folks don't categorize themselves as ableist. So that's why understanding this can be really helpful for us as people with disabilities, or myself as a trainer, or myself when I'm being an advocate, or for hospitals and law enforcement to kind of understand that they may have underlying biases about disabled people that are making them cause harm in ways that they don't realize. Another term that I want to talk about is intersectionality. This may be a term that you've heard in a lot of different areas. Intersectionality was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor in Chicago. Coincidence. And she developed this to better describe the experiences of Black women as they differed from Black men and from white women. Because for her, her identity as a Black woman was compounding. And she defines this as a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides and where it interlocks and intersects. Because all of these identities that we all have multiple identities. You may have your identity through your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, your ethnicity, your disability, if you are a part of the deaf community, where you grew up. We all have these different identities, but some of our identities are used to overpower. So we can see how there have been laws that have made it more difficult for women or for people of color or for queer people to have the same rights and access to the same supports and services as folks who have the majority identity or the identity that is not criticized in this way. So I kind of think of it also as this Venn diagram where red, blue, and yellow are our primary colors, right? And they make up every other color that we can see as humans can be made from these three colors. And so orange is its own thing, but it's also red and yellow. But if we're only talking about red and yellow, or we're only talking about gender and race, but separately, we never see how those interact together. If we're only talking about being a survivor of domestic violence, but we're not talking about disability, we're not seeing what happens in between when those colors overlap. We're not seeing what that experience is like for that person. And so it can be challenging for people who are providing support and services or people who are moving through this to kind of understand that. Um, and I included a video on this that I'm going to play really fast because I think it explains it a little better than I do. It's only, I believe, like 2 minutes long. So I'm going to play it. And if I don't hear anything, I will assume that you all can hear it. So let's hope for the best.
Let's talk about disability and intersectionality. Odds are that by now you've heard the term intersectionality. Intersectionality was coined by Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. Crenshaw describes intersectionality as a tool to understand the ways that different systems of oppression, for example, racism, homophobia, ableism, and so on, often interact to create obstacles that cannot be well understood by considering these systems separately. Instead, you need to think about how they can reinforce each other. Intersectionality is also used to talk about how individuals have many identities and how some people are subject to multiple types of disadvantage because of who they are. So, how does disability fit into intersectionality? Well, being a person with a disability, or disabled person if you use identity first language, is one such identity that can cause people to face disadvantages. I used the word that describes the system of discrimination earlier, ableism. Ableism can come in many forms, like designing buildings that are inaccessible, using disability as an insult, or thinking that someone's disability is a problem that needs to be fixed. Folks with disabilities may face challenges due to ableism in addition to other forms of inequality, depending on their other identities. In upcoming videos, we hope to talk to people about the interplay between disability and other identities, and between ableism and other forms of oppression, with the goal of bringing greater understanding to the varieties of experiences that exist and the ways that we can combat inequity.
Yay. We love a multimedia moment. Now it's not letting me go to the next slide. So hold on 1 second. I don't know why. Okay. That was fun for everyone. So intersectionality is this, basically it's just a way for us to think that we are not thinking about people only as, in this instance, disabled or only as survivors or people experiencing domestic violence. We know that intersectionality and disability is a huge thing that is focused on in the disability justice movement. We know that people over 65, trans people, Native American and Alaska Native people, multiracial people, people living in poverty, and LGBTQIA second spirit plus people are the most likely to have a disability. This is a complicated topic to talk about because there are lots of reasons why these groups have disabilities and why these marginalizations for their identities exist. And we don't have time to discuss all of that to the depth that I would like to. And I think this gives us kind of a good starting point of why we're considering all of people's identities when we're talking to people with disabilities, because no one is just their disability. Nobody is just their survivorship. Nobody is just their race or their gender or their age. We are all everything all at once. And the sum of that just makes our experiences different, both with how we view the world and how the world views us. So that's why I wanted to kind of ground set here around ableism and disability. So when we talk about disability and domestic violence, we know that people with disabilities have higher rates of poverty, social isolation, and barriers to help seeking. And abusive people can take advantage of these consequences of ableism. And also that becomes compounded by that abusive partner's perception of disabled people as vulnerable. So an abusive partner can take advantage of how ableism hurts us. And then also they kind of have these ingrained biases that a disabled person is more vulnerable or less likely to stand up, more easier to control and overpower, which in some instances can be true because of ableism, because of the realities of living in maybe a physically disabled body or having a psychiatric disability, something like that. We know that abusive people target people with disabilities because they perceive them as more vulnerable. We also know that people who are in abusive relationships are more likely to become disabled or have their disability exacerbated. That can be because of the mental and physical and psychological effects of living with an abusive partner or experiencing physical abuse. And let me know if you can't hear me. My window's open and I live near the airport, so there's like jets flying over. So if I'm having sound issues, please let me know. But if I don't hear anything, I will assume we're fine. The giant jet just flew over. Okay. We also know that any limitation that could affect someone's ability to manage their daily life increases their risk of abuse by an intimate partner. So if there's a difference in power and status, if abusive partners are like a medical support or have a caregiving role for that person's daily living activities, that can be a really scary opportunity for an abusive partner to exert power and control. For example, if someone relies on their partner to help them get into the shower or open their pill bottles or get into the car or relies on them to drive them somewhere, that is a way that an abusive partner can leverage that reliance and that support they're providing and turn it into something really dark to overpower and control that person. And for a lot of people with disabilities, leaving an abusive partner may mean that they lose access to having their needs met. Their abusive partner, maybe they're married and they're on that person's health insurance. Maybe that's the only way that they have access to housing because they don't have enough money, and they're not able to save up money because of their disability benefits and the way that benefits are structured. So there's lots of different ways that leaving an abusive partner can be more challenging for someone with a disability. Okay, we're going to take a breather. It's just going to be real quick. We're going to stretch. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or unmute if you're able to. Thank you so much, Robert, for saying the sound is good. I appreciate that. If you don't have questions, that's fine too. I'm happy to continue yapping. And you all can look at this picture I took again, different picture, different day of my favorite part of Chicago. It helps me relax. So this is more for me than you, but I will explain it to you. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Questions, please pop them in the chat, even though it's not the formal question time as we move forward. I am happy to answer those. I don't know why this isn't moving. Okay. I just want to bring back the door locks to kind of have that visual in our head again. all the different ways that systems, abusive partners, the way our system works, can create more barriers to someone leaving a relationship and also getting the support and services that they need. So I've talked a little bit about the ways that abuse can happen for folks with disabilities, but I just want to talk about it a little bit more here and give some more examples. One of the big things that we see is withholding medication or treatment. So not allowing someone to have access to the medication or the treatment that they need. This could be literally hiding their medication, taking their medication for themselves, selling their medication, especially if they're taking a medication that has a street value. They may not allow them access to treatment by threatening to remove them from their insurance. They may accompany them to health visits and kind of control the visit and not allow them to ask for the things that they need. They may not allow them access to reproductive health care, things about pregnancy and preventing pregnancy or supporting pregnancies. It's something that we see. Another thing is damaging accessibility devices, or withholding access, damaging wheelchairs and walkers, maybe putting accessibility devices in a place where it's difficult for someone to get them, putting them upstairs, putting them out of reach, hiding them somewhere, just kind of messing with them maybe in smaller ways about withholding access, or completely destroying, hiding, removing wheelchairs or walkers. This can also be, accessibility devices are not just things that feel like they're only for disabled people, right? There are accessibility devices that we all use. It could be a telephone, it could be a computer, it could be, step stools in the house, it could be all sorts of things that are very typical things that everyone uses to make their life easier, but for disabled people can be critical to them moving through their day. Restricting access to society, language, family, or friends. This is isolation. Often this is to a higher degree. They may refuse to learn sign language. They may refuse to communicate with that person. They may remove devices that help them with hearing or with vision, things like that. They may restrict access to the deaf community for people who are part of the deaf community, who may or may not be disabled. They may threaten to institutionalize or hospitalize somebody with a disability. This is something that often happens with people who have physical or intellectual disabilities, but this is often something that can happen with folks who have mental health disabilities, folks who maybe have trauma or psychosis or other severe mental health illnesses, and partner can threaten to have them hospitalized. They can threaten to have them institutionalized. They can kind of use that stigma against folks with mental health disorders to rot away at their self-esteem. No one's going to believe you. Who would believe, an addict? No one's going to believe you. You're drunk all the time. They might try to physically overpower and harm somebody with a disability, which could be more severe for folks with physical disabilities. Again, using that societal stigma against survivors with a disability, calling them names, saying that they're worthless, using slurs against disabled people on them, kind of making them feel worthless. And that's something that a lot of abusive partners will do, because they'll say, well, no one will love you like I love you, because you're, all sorts of negative things associated with their disability or other aspects of their identity. And they may also use mental health or substance use coercion, which I talked about a little bit, but it's using their mental health or substance use disability or use status against them, saying that no one will believe you. They're just going to put you in the hospital. They're going to take your kids away. You'll get arrested. You'll lose your green card or your visa if they find out that you're using substances. Using all of these things against somebody, using the way that society views people with mental health and substance use issues against them, using the way that people feel about people with other disabilities against them, to kind of just make them feel like they have no power, both in relationship and if they were to try to access support and services outside of that relationship. There's other ways that they may use societal stigma and domestic violence. In some bigger ways that I just wanted to talk about more directly. These big ways is studies have found that abusive partners may be believed over a survivor with a disability. Law enforcement will often believe someone who appears to be normal and stable over somebody who maybe has a disability, is crying, is activated because of the abuse, but also maybe has other symptoms or characteristics of their disability that are showing up that make the officers feel like maybe they're not as trustworthy. This is also even worse. We talked about intersectionality for folks who have a disability, who are survivors, who are Black or who are people of color or are Indigenous. There are other aspects of identity that can compound against this, like we talked about. And so with law enforcement is where we really see this happen a lot. People with disabilities are more likely to be victims of crimes. They're more likely to get arrested, face criminal charges, and receive longer prison sentences than folks who do the same things who don't have disabilities. So it's this weird situation where society is often telling survivors and telling people with disabilities, you are not capable, you don't have as much free will, you don't have as much autonomy. But also, if you break the law or we think you're breaking the law, then you're going to be held more accountable and punished more than somebody without a disability. And of course, we see these disparities among people who are not white, who are not men, who are not disabled, who are not LGBTQIA. So we see that happen a lot. And like I said, survivors might be perceived as unstable, weak, or crazy, or disconnected from reality because of their disability. So officers may feel like that they can't trust what that person is saying because of their mental illness or because of their substance use status or another disability. Yeah. So that can be a big issue with law enforcement, especially because this is often the first thing that folks outside of a relationship that's violent or abusive think about as a remedy. We often are told when we're growing up, the police will help, calling the police will help. But a lot of survivors with disabilities of color, queer survivors often feel like law enforcement can make things worse inside with the abusive partner. So something important to think about as we, as people, are figuring out how we're going to support the people around us. Another place that we really see societal stigma and ableism rear its head in these instances is with child protective services. I want to be very clear. Studies show, and we know, that people with disabilities are just as good of parents as those without disabilities. We know that. There have been studies done. People with disabilities are not more likely to neglect, to harm, to mistreat, to abuse children in any way. However, 30 to 50% of parents with disabilities will ultimately lose custody with child protective services involvement. Parents with psychiatric disabilities face removal rates of 70 to 80%. These can be temporary removals, but those are still as traumatic or, are still traumatic for the entire family when they are taking place. At the time that I wrote this, 42 states include disability as grounds for completely terminating parental rights, even if there is no abuse, no neglect. Just being disabled is enough to have your rights terminated as a parent in 42 states. So this is a really important point when we're thinking about how abusive partners can leverage that against survivors. This is something that happens in a lot of abusive situations where the abusive partner will say, Child Protective Services is going to take your kid away. You didn't protect them when I was abusive. Maybe the abusive partner is also abusing the child, and the survivor is afraid to call for help because these things happen. We know that more than double there's 19% of all kids in foster care have a disabled parent compared to only 9% of children who are not in foster care. So there's a much higher level of disabled parenting among kids in foster care. And again, as we said, it's not because these people are abusing their kids at higher rates. It's because they are being perceived as abusing kids at higher rates. I see a question asking for those states, and I don't know, but I will look it up. And I can get it to you probably at the end of this if I look it up real fast. I'll have to see where my citation was for that. Yeah. And we also know that especially DV survivors, especially survivors of color, are targeted by child welfare and face a lot of barriers to maintaining custody once child welfare is involved. We also know that survivors are less likely to maintain custody over their children if they disclose that they're being abused. So if they're getting divorced and they explain that they were being abused, those parents receive less parenting time than parents who do not disclose abuse. So in a lot of instances, we're seeing that a parent sharing that they're a victim of domestic violence is harmful to them because they are getting less time with their child than if they had not said anything. So we know that that's really bad, right? And I don't say it that way to be smug or not serious, but that's very detrimental when folks are afraid to ask for help because they don't want to lose their kids. They're afraid to disclose what is going on because they don't want to lose their children. And that helps abusive partners. All of these things help abusive partners. And these are things that a lot of abusive partners know about, either because they, have thought about this or just they intrinsically know that disabled people are treated a different way than people without disabilities. Okay. This does not want to move forward. Another place that I wanted to talk about where systemic ableism happens and affects survivors is in the healthcare system. Healthcare professionals are often the first line in identifying and supporting survivors of domestic violence. The majority of my work in domestic violence has also overlapped with the healthcare setting because we know that disabled people are abused at higher rates than folks without disability. And we know that people who are abused are often injured or disabled as a result of the abuse, either from actual physical violence causing a disability and from the neurological systemic harm to our bodies that happens when we're in stress all the time. We see higher rates and exacerbation of diabetes, heart conditions, asthma, any kind of mental health condition can be exacerbated by the trauma of being in an abusive relationship. And we know that people with disabilities often experience not only physical accessibility issues going into a healthcare facility, but attitudinal ableism. So they're not being treated as any other patient would be treated because they have a disability. Maybe they're not being listened to. They're being written off. They're being told that it's all in their head, or they like the attention, or they want everything to be a problem. These are things that a lot of people with disabilities hear from healthcare professionals. And when they're coming in as a survivor, it can be even more challenging to access healthcare for conditions related to the abuse, but also things outside of that. We also see this a lot with access to reproductive care, not allowing a parent to get prenatal visits, not allowing them to have the birthing experience that they want. And this comes both from the healthcare setting and from partners. We've seen a lot of instances of disabled parents having child protective services called on them before the baby's even born, because someone in the hospital feels like, well, this person clearly is not capable of parenting because of how I perceive them and their disability. So that's another barrier to not only getting healthcare, but having this door open for healthcare professionals who can say, hey, I talk to all my patients about this because it's really important. Are you feeling safe at home? Is your partner supportive? Are your caregivers supportive? Is there anything going on that I can help you with, both to connect you with maybe housing or a domestic violence advocate or social work or therapy, or that I should just know as I help with your healthcare? Maybe there are things that medical professionals can do to support disabled survivors that they haven't thought about before. One of the biggest things that I see is changing the medication they take to something that cannot be stolen, cannot be abused by the abusive partner. Another huge thing that I saw for a while was people getting IUDs instead of taking birth control pills because their partners were throwing away their birth control pills. So there are ways that providers, when they know that abuse is happening, can provide care in a way that helps support the survivor and helps support a disabled person as they're moving through their day to day, just trying to make it one day at a time. Not only getting through the one day at a time, but how can we build towards a life where that person is free from the abusive partner? And I went off slide and kept talking because this is one of those areas that is so important and so detrimental to survivors and people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses. It's really important. And again, that intersectionality is so important because racial and ethnic minorities receive lower quality healthcare than white people. Transgender people are often facing discrimination and disbelief from providers. And we know that these are also folks who are more likely to be disabled, and are more likely to face ableism in concert with the other forms of discrimination they're facing because of their identities. So something important to know, also a big opportunity here for abusers to get involved, to go to the healthcare appointments and make sure the person, maybe the doctor says, oh, you have like some bruising on your shoulder. What is that? And the abusive partner looks over and makes sure that she says, oh, I fell into the wall, I stumbled into something, and not saying what really happened, which is maybe that she was physically harmed. So anytime we have a system that is harmful to people with disabilities, that kind of melts away as an option for support and services for a lot of people. And we hate to see that when we're talking about law enforcement, child protective services, healthcare, and also in housing. I'm going to go fast because we have like 10 minutes left and I just want to leave room and I can't recall how many slides I have left. But we know with housing, less than 5% of homes or housing units are accessible to people with moderate mobility difficulties, and less than 1% would allow a wheelchair user to live there independently. This includes all homes. This includes Section 8 housing. This includes domestic violence housing, transitional housing, halfway houses, facilities that are not institutions, not hospital-based facilities, but maybe assisted living facilities outside of hospitals. And research has found that people with disabilities are more likely to experience unaffordable, insecure, or poor housing quality. A lot of this is tied into how disabled people are ostracized or unable to work to have gainful employment, and are also unable to get a lot of the benefits through the welfare system for people with disabilities without that kind of prevents them from being able to save up money. There are a lot of barriers that come in with that. So that can be a big challenge. People with mental health disabilities often are unjustly evicted from their homes because of reasons with their disability. Maybe if someone is just acting in a way that people think is peculiar, or they're being louder than they want them to be, or their behaviors just feel incongruous with what they're expecting. That can be, there are people who have been evicted because of those behaviors, and discriminated against because of their disability. Survivors with substance use concerns are also at a higher risk for eviction, which is exacerbated by classism. So that's, prejudice against people who do not have as much money as other groups of people, racism, and homophobia. So housing becomes a big challenge as well. And we can see how all of these things are locks on that door that are keeping a survivor, a person with disabilities, in a relationship that is causing them harm, both physically, emotionally, spiritually, isolation, all of these things. So to kind of summarize all that I've talked about today, domestic violence affects people with disabilities at higher rates than those without disabilities. Abusive partners can use a survivor's disability as a way to abuse and control them. The systems that support survivors of DV can be ableist, harmful, and inaccessible to survivors. We talked about housing, we talked about police, we talked about child protective services, and we talked about the healthcare system. Those are just 4 systems. There's also, the challenges they face talking to an individual therapist, the challenges that they face trying to apply for food stamps or for WIC, or to try to talk to somebody at domestic violence shelter who can use an interpreter or who uses ASL. These things these are additional barriers that I didn't have a chance to get into today, but I think these are kind of the big system ones. And intersectionality is an important way to view ableism and discrimination against survivors with disability, because we're never just working with a survivor of domestic violence or a person with a disability or an immigrant or a lesbian or whatever. People are not just one thing. Um, and it's important when we are trying to navigate all of these systems, as whether we ourselves are personal advocates for people in our lives, professional advocates, advocates for ourselves, advocates for family members, if we're caregivers for others. It's important for us to view these things as more than just disability or more than just domestic violence. So, what comes next? In May, we're going to talk a lot about what we can do. The biggest kind of problem that comes up when I do training or any kind of education with people is that it feels really bad and overwhelming and they don't know what to do. And a lot of us are ingrained to want to fix, and trying to fix a problem as big as abuse and societal ableism is huge. So, what we're really going to focus on is what we can do when we're kind of navigating that as individuals. And then I'll talk a little bit about professionals and things like that. That's going to be more in the June one about building connections, is going to be more about organizations building partnership. But what we talk about in May is going to be much more about what individuals can do to help navigate these systems and support survivors in their lives with or without disabilities, or people with disabilities who may not be survivors but are still having challenges navigating some of these systems. I think it'll be helpful for in a lot of different ways. I have some resources here. These are very basic. I will be honest, I have not used the New Jersey ones and I'm not as familiar with them, but I wanted to share them here. But they are great organizations. I just personally don't know folks there and haven't used them, but this should be good. Except the courts. The courts is the courts. But you got it. And then these are some references if you're curious. And as I said, please feel free to email me. Oh, my email's not on here. Okay. Now it is. At the bottom here. I'm live editing this for you. You're so welcome. Yeah, please feel free. I'll put it in the chat so I can stop this. But please feel free to email me. Please feel free to ask more questions in the chat. Yes, thank you, Erin. Let me real quick look and see what those other 8 states were.
So while you do that, Ember, I'm going to put we do have a flyer about mental health hotlines specific to New Jersey, and I'm going to put that in the chat. We also, if anyone needs or is interested, we do have coping skills available on our website in our resources tab, but I'll also put those in the chat as well. And if anyone, I'm just going to reiterate what Ember had said earlier. If anyone has any specific concerns or questions and you're not comfortable asking or talking about them in front of anybody, you can reach out to Ember. You can also reach out to Bianca and myself, and we can reach out to Ember, or we can get you in touch with specific resources in New Jersey. But just know that there are people here to help if you need it in any way. I will also put in the chat the link for all of our recorded webinars to sign up for future webinars and to see the last part 1 that Ember did. This webinar is recorded and will be put up on our website in a few days. So while Ember is...
Thank you so much. And I found yeah, I found a thick article. That's where I found it from. And it's kind of difficult for me to tell you what the 8 states are that allow it, but it breaks down how each state defines disability, what's considered a disability, and whether or not it's grounds for removal. So some states will include any level of substance use as a disability and also grounds for removal, whereas other states don't. So I've shared that here. It's a long document, but on page 34 has a lot of the citations. But if if anybody is the person who had the question of 8 states, if you want to give me your email address too, I can email that to you. I can break it down later if that article is not helpful. But just let me know. The article has a lot of good stuff, but it's also a law article, so you have to read the footnotes. And if you've never done that before, it's going to be so confusing. I just don't have a better thing in front of me right now.
So that was Colleen. Colleen, if you want to send to Ember your email or put that in the chat as well.
Yeah. And thank you. It's so hard for me to see your names, and I'm such a name caller. Okay, Colleen, I got your email. Great. Um, yeah.
Gabrielle also put in chat that sharing that in New Jersey, we have a resource hub meant to help interpersonal violence providers and disability agencies collaborate to help increase safety and access for all survivors. So that is an amazing resource. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Again, the Q&A is open. Um, Adam, I see you posted. Adam is located in Boston. Thanks for joining us, Adam. But if,
Brandy, oh, I was
oh,
going to say, Brandy, the PowerPoint, the recording will be posted and the PowerPoint slides should be available. Erin will have those up for
yes.
you all.
Frankie puts those up probably in a day or two. Just keep checking our website, and I will actually put the link I put in the chat goes right to our webinar page, and that's where the recording will be. However, if someone is looking for resources that we have available, I will put that link in the chat as well. So that will go directly right to our resources. Excellent. And again, if you're like me and you think of a million questions as soon as the webinar ends, feel free to reach out to Ember, Bianca, or myself, and we will respond and try to help you as well.
I also just shared an our website I just found just very quickly, but it has an interactive map and you can hover over each state and it will tell you which disabilities are grounds for termination of parental rights or TPR. And so it separates it through IDD, so intellectual or developmental, psychiatric, physical, substance use, and other. And you can see those states. And for New Jersey, it looks like it's intellectual disabilities, psychiatric, and substance use disorder.
That is
Um,
disappointing.
are grounds. Yes, that is disappointing.
Oh, we're twins with you over in Illinois.
Yeah, I know. I expected more from Illinois, but here you go. Who knew Florida would be doing better? Florida's my home state, so I'm allowed to talk trash about it, but no one else is.
That's how we feel about Jersey.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like we have kinship. Like, yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ember, for doing this. It is a tough topic, but you present it in such a way that it is very attainable information. So I appreciate that. I appreciate everybody for coming on and learning about this. And I saw someone asked if I could send them the part one. I will email you the link to part one. But again, everything is on our website. And again, thank you all so much. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Tuesday. And I just thank you for coming. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone.